Let's make my Whimsy quilt pattern using 20 fat quarters and 1.5 yards of background fabric, yielding a twin size quilt measuring at 64 inches by 80 inches. Weathered Whimsy is perfect for beginners who want to create a bed-size quilt. And for my fabrics, I am using a mixture of designers and brands to create a muted palette. And for my background, I am using this newspaper dictionary print since I have a wide variety of lights and dark fat quarters. With each fat quarter, you are going to cut one 8.5 inch by 16.5 inch rectangle and two 2.5 inch by 18 inch rectangles. Then as a bonus, if you cut one more 2.5 inch by the full length of your fat quarter, you will have enough for a scrappy binding so nothing goes to waste. Then with your background fabric, you will cut 40 2.5 inch by 18 inch strips. And that's it. Now we're going to get to sewing. So first up, you will take two matching prints in a 2.5 inch by 18 inch rectangles and two background strips in the same size, and we are going to sew them together to form a stripy quilt block. And special tip, if you are sewing everything together, throughout this entire quilt, press your seams either to your print or the background fabric, preferably whichever is the dark side, because everything in this quilt will then nestle together perfectly. Once your strip set is complete, you will subcut it into four 4.5 inch by 8.5 inch rectangles. With those cuts, we will sew everything back together in this checkerboard-like pattern by rotating a few strips upside down. And once again, if you press your seams all in the same direction, everything will nestle together when you sew this block, which will yield a 8.5 inch by 16.5 inch rectangle. Once your checkerboard rectangle is pieced together, you will then take a different print in an 8.5 inch by 16.5 inch rectangle and sew it to the left side of your pieced rectangle, leaving you with a 16.5 inch squared quilt block. Now all you have to do is repeat this step until you have made a total of 20 quilt blocks. Once all of your blocks are made, you will lay them out in a 4x5 block layout. For your odd rows, you will lay the checkerboard on the right side, and for your even rows, you will lay the checkerboards on the left side. Then as always, sew your blocks together to form rows, and lastly, sew your rows together to complete your quilt top. And here is what my weathered Whimsy quilt pattern looks like all finished. Stick around towards the end so you can see the entire quilt. Since we created a jumbo quilt block, it can barely fit on my table, but for the backing, I am using the same print I selected for my background. And then for the thread choice, I am going with glide threads in the color Stone. And here is what my quilt looks like all quilted. 20 fat quarters and 1.5 yards for your background fabric will yield you a twin size quilt measuring at 64 inches by 80 inches. Here is a close-up of the quilting, and you can see I used the remaining strips from our fat quarters as a scrappy binding, which I love since it randomly adds a little pop of color around the edges. And here is a photo to see more of the quilt, since we pieced together a huge quilt block that is perfect for beginners. But if you could please take a moment to hit that like and subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you can be notified for your next amazing quilt project.